So what does protein do? Protein is made up of amino acids. Amino acids grow the rumen microbes, and the more microbes, the better. It's responsible for for muscle growth, fetal growth, pregnancy, and milk production. And the more protein that you can have in the diet, balanced with energy, the greater microbial protein yield you have, because you have more bugs in the diet. And the more microbial protein yield you have, the more amino acids that you're going to pass through the animal for it to be to use as growth or building blocks. So it's measured as percentage of crude protein, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It is crude protein. So it's measured as the amount of nitrogen in the feed. Nitrogen times 6.25%. Nitrogen percentage times 6.25, sorry. There's basically the things that we need to focus on when we're talking about animals is rumen degradable protein and what we call bypass protein. So that's protein that's to get graded in the stomach by the microbes, and then protein that's absorbed in the small intestine directly bypasses the stomach. So young animals have a greater requirement for bypass protein, and mature animals can handle a lot more rumen degradable protein. And there's a couple of different types of protein. You've got non-protein nitrogens like urea, which is not necessarily a true protein. It's coming from a source of ammonia, or it's converted directly into a source of ammonia. And then you've got your true proteins, which is coming from your grasses and your grains and your protein meals, and that's going to provide you with amino acids. So poor pasture, you're going to have less than 10% protein in it. Good pasture, 25 to 30% protein, mostly rumen degradable protein. Livestock require a minimum of 8 to 10% for maintenance. So that's all we need to supply for a mature animal to just run along as some dry stock. Lactating animals, younger animals and weaners, so any animal in production or any animal that's in a growing phase, we need to have an overall diet of 15 to 16%. That's what we're targeting. And pregnant animals, we need about 12%. So these numbers are the overall diet. These numbers will be in this book. Fibre. Fibre is, generally speaking, in sheep in the spring and summer, one of the biggest limiting nutrients before energy and protein are. So fibre is essential for rumen function, rumen motility, so the expansion and contraction of the rumen. The fibre plays a role in helping facilitate the nutrients to the edge of the rumen so that we can transfer the nutrients across the rumen wall. It is essential for saliva production, so chewing of the animal's cud produces a natural buffer called bicarbonate. Sodium bicarb is also used as sometimes in diets that we make for sheep or cattle, we use a bit of sodium bicarb as a buffer. So it's naturally produced by the animal. So the length promotes chewing and saliva production, and it's critical that we get the right amount of fibre into the diet, but it's critical that we don't get too much into the diet. So this table here might be a little bit hard to see, but up the top here, we've basically got a plant or a carbohydrate or a forage source. And I'll just use this graph because it just sort of breaks down the structural composition of a plant and gets you to visualise what your plant's going to look like as we move through the winter, the spring and into the summer. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the soluble carbohydrates, so the sugars, starch and pectin, which is actually a fibre source. But the digestibility of these is very good, 95 to 100%. On the right-hand side, we've got the structural components or the fibre components of the plant. We've got fibre coming from the cell walls, and that's pectin. Generally, it's got a fair amount of digestibility in it. But then down here, we've got two terms that you need to be familiar with, particularly if you're going to be purchasing hay, is neutral detergent fibre and acid detergent fibre. So neutral detergent fibre is the amount of physically effective fibre in the diet. So that's a really important number or really important term you need to be familiar with, particularly if you're buying hay and particularly if you're looking at feed tests. It's also the number that we use to determine the intake potential of that animal. So that number can give us a huge amount of information on whether that sheep or that cow can fully eat that feed up to its maximum. Because if that number's too high, it physically fills the animal up, and if the nutrient density in that feed is too low, we can be filling the animal up but not meeting its needs. And that happens very easily and very quickly during the spring and summer when your pasture hay's off. So neutral detergent fibre is broken down to hemicellulose. In here, relative digestibility, it varies depending on the feed. And then acid detergent fibre is the fibre that's completely unutilisable by the animal. And we see high values in acid detergent fibre when we've got heat damage, rain damage, things like that on hays, particularly hays. It's cellulose and lignin, relatively poor digestibility. I know there's a few rice growers in the room. Has anyone baled rice straw and sold it? No? Yep. Didn't say use it, it said sold it. Sold it. Yeah, good. Did you sell it a long way away?
Yes. We know.
Been in a drought before?
I have.
Yeah. Rice straw is an effective fibre source, and there is some big feedlots that are actually using rice straw in their mixes, but they're balancing the diet and using it to the right volume. They're not trying to make it up as a whole feed source. So that's why there's a market for it. But if you were to try and feed it as a replacement for something else, it's not a very good feed. So it's high in fibre, and in that fibre content is it has a high silica content. And in the leaves, it's greater than the stems. Silica is indigestible, and it decreases the digestibility of the feed. And what that means is silica falls into this category, acid detergent fibre, so it's completely unutilisable by the animal. And we want to use it in the diet to stimulate chewing and saliva production, but if we use too much in the diet, all that happens is it stays in the rumen for too long. So cereal straw, generally speaking, is going to sit in the rumen and take about up to 72 hours to digest. So that's why we just use it as a fibre source, say in a feedlot, where we've got a really good grain and protein mix in the diet. If we use rice straw, because of that higher portion of silica, the dwell time, or the amount of time it stays in the rumen for, is plus 72 hours and up to 96 hours. And based on that, if we fill the animal up with rice straw and it's sitting in there for 3 to 4 days, and the sheep can't eat much more of it, and it's only got an ME of 6 and a crude protein of 4, the animal is not even going to be able to meet its maintenance requirements, and it can't eat anything else because it's full from the rice straw. So you get this, you'll see, if you've fed rice straw before, you'll see animals, or any straw, they'll go to it if they're hungry. They'll go to it and they'll eat probably half a bale or a bale in the first couple of days, and you'll go back there in 3 or 4 days and you'll be like, oh, that's great, they ate it, we could probably get away with this, no dramas. Then the next bale you put out there, they hardly touch it, and the animals start to slip. And that's just because it takes so long to digest through their system that the nutrient value that it provides is so much less than the time it takes to digest, they actually go backwards. So this is a Dairy Australia slide. There's a Dairy Australia person in the room, so I thought I'd better reference it. But they've been through a couple of droughts themselves, and they've had all sorts of weird and wonderful feeds go into the diet. So it's a great source for plenty of different feed types if you're looking for some information. Minerals and vitamins, hole in the bucket. So generally we don't see too much of an issue, apart from something like calcium. Generally we don't see too much of an issue with minerals and vitamins, and you won't notice it in your flock until at least 20% of the flock is stressed or showing a deficiency. So it's very hard to pick. Macros, we're talking in grams per kilogram: calcium, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium and sodium. Micros, we're talking in milligrams per kilogram: copper, cobalt, selenium, zinc and manganese. Vitamins are A, D and E. Cereal grains, they're notoriously deficient in calcium, and we need a calcium to phosphorus ratio in all our diets for sheep of 2 to 1. 2 units of calcium to 1 unit of phosphorus. So if you take anything home from this day, whenever you're going to feed grain, make sure you have access to lime and salt, or if you're choosing to feed any other feed sources, make sure that there's a 2-to-1 calcium to phosphorus ratio on it if it's a manufactured feed. So we need to get the lime source, stock lime, we need to get that into the diet. Because over time, if we don't feed grain, we slowly deplete the reserve of calcium in the diet, and then when it comes time for calcification of the fetus, 4 to 6 weeks prior to lambing, or we have an event where we have to handle the sheep 4 to 6 weeks, so pre-lambing drench or a vaccination, or shift them into a better paddock, particularly bigger animals that'll be twin lambers, and they're generally older sheep, you start to see deficiencies show up, and that's where you see hypocalcemia. So we saw a lot of it this autumn in those types of sheep, and they'd been on grain since September and October last year. So always supplement with lime whenever you're feeding grain. If you're off green feed for more than 2 months, vitamin A, D and E can be deficient, but generally you can go for a fairly extended period before you need to supplement with it. And Linda will touch base on a couple of these as well. Your B group vitamins will be synthesised by the ruminant, within the ruminant itself, generally speaking. So the thing we want to focus on, and the take-home message, is calcium always with grain. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is lime and salt, we're on dry feed and grain. If we've got some short green pick in the paddock and we're still feeding a heavy grain diet, we need to start, and generally that's in the autumn when you use at the heaviest point of pregnancy as well, we need to start putting a little bit of magnesium into the diet, because those short pastures that are lush and green will be very high in potassium, and potassium inhibits or will have a negative effect on magnesium absorption, and magnesium plays a critical role in regulating calcium absorption. So now we're becoming 2 steps removed from calcium. But keep those things in mind. We saw it this year again. We saw people putting animals on, like, haven't had any green pick for ages, and if you haven't been to the pub for 6 months, you're dying for a beer and you just can't wait to get there. Well, that's what these people are like with their short green pick on the river flats. And there was Phalaris 2 to 3 inches high and a smattering of it. I'm like, beauty, we're going to be able to stop feeding. Put the ewes in there, bang, within 2 or 3 days, 30 or 40 down with hypocalcemia. And they'd walk them down a laneway and put them into a fresh green paddock. And that's all that happened. So it happens very quickly because they've got a huge draw for calcium at that time in their life because they're heavily pregnant. This is a lifetime ewe graph. There's tables there. This is a good reference point. I'm sure some of you are familiar with lifetime ewe management. It's a heavily funded program by the AWI and MLA, and it's probably the leading sort of productivity guide for ewes at the moment. And I'd use this as a reference point moving through the spring and summer and autumn if you're trying to put some framework around your decision making on your animal's requirements. So normally I would use condition score 3 to maintain weight, but I'm sure there would be plenty of people here that would be comfortable saying that there's a lot of sheep out there that are condition score 2. Yes? No? So condition score 2 is not an ideal situation, but it's the reality this year. For a medium frame ewe, 50 kilos dry, they need 7 megajoules of energy per day just to maintain that condition score 2. 50 kilos. 130 days pregnant, we go up to 10.8, or call it 11, and 13.5 for twins. So we start to see a pretty sharp increase. 30 days into lactation, we're nearly needing 18 megajoules for a single and 23 megajoules for a twin. Now, a ewe physically cannot obtain that much energy out of her diet. So how does she get the deficit, fill the deficit here? From body weight. she feels a deficit from stripping the fat off her back. And that's why it's absolutely critical that we want the ewe to get as fat as she can once we've weaned the lamb in the spring on the cheap feed when we've got the spring flush. So everyone here, most people May, June lambers? Yep. Has anyone still got lambs at foot with their ewes? That's good. One.
I've got a plan, excuse me, got a plan to join later with my flock shed.
Yes.
Because the last thing I want to do is to be hand feeding those ewes when they go to work.
Yes, so you want a lamb, say, in July because you'll know you'll have a body of green feed on.
Well, we just hope.
Hopefully. Yeah. Hopefully I'm not doing a talk here in July next year. So good. Everybody should have weaned their lambs because we reduce the energy drawn at ewe once we wean the lamb. The lamb's going to do better. We can prioritise the feed for the lamb. But what it gives us the opportunity to do is put condition on that ewe on lower quality feed. When we get that ewe as fat as we can, then we can manage the slide all the way through to lambing. So we get ewes fat as whales in the spring, and they can be condition score 4. But we want to lamb her in 3.3 for a twin, and we want to lamb her in 3 ideally as a single. And your flock might be different. You might lamb a bit under that. But just from the lifetime ewe management stuff and all the work that they've done on it, they give the greatest potential for realising on those fetuses to become lambs, because at those 2 body condition scores decreases the chances of ewe mortality, and it gives your lamb birth weight to be the right weight. And that has a massive impact on lamb survival. So we want to get that fat on the ewe as much as we can through the spring and manage the slide. To put half a condition score on a ewe in a 30-day period requires 10 megajoules of energy a day over her maintenance requirements. So if we wanted to put half a condition score, if we want to get this ewe to 2.5 and she's dry now, she needs to be eating 17 megajoules, or she needs to be able to have access to 17 megajoules of energy a day. To put that into perspective, that is 6 inches of irrigated clover ryegrass pasture with probably 30 or 40% clover in it. So that's what she needs. It needs to be absolutely smoking feed. So it's much easier to get that fat on the ewe through the flush of spring with your free feed, because your cheapest feed on your farm is going to be the feed that grows itself, and then manage the slide, because you can supplement and then manage the condition off her back. Also here, is anyone confinement feeding? Got sheep locked up? Not yet? Potentially. Could happen. We want to maintain ground cover where we can, but you'll see here, this might change your mind. Confinement feeding for a medium frame ewe, so the same body weight in a containment area, 6 megajoules a day for dry, or 7 for... so reduction in 17% or 16.5%, 17% of energy requirement. You extrapolate that over 1,000, 2,000, even 500 ewes, and you've got to do it for potentially 5 months. Yes, there is associated risk with confinement feeding and all those other things, but straight away you've got a reduction in energy requirement. And can anyone tell me why that reduction occurs?
They're not walking around the paddock.
Simple as that. So they don't use the energy for maintenance. Energy and protein needs of fast-growing lambs. This is from the NRC. So they set the guidelines for nutrient requirements for domesticated ruminants. We won't work on a 50-kilo live weight lamb. We'll work on everybody be comfortable with a 30-kilo merino ewe weaner. We've got to get this. We need these ewe weaners to keep moving on a rising plane of nutrition all the way through the spring and summer and autumn, because we want them to continue to grow. So this is, if we were going to get 325 grams a day we'll be doing real well out of a merino weaner, but for a crossbred, dry matter intake would be about 1.4 kilos, and that would be based on about 4.7% of their body weight. The density of the feed would need to be 12 megajoules per kilogram of dry matter, and the total megajoule is 16.7. So that's that lush irrigated pasture. I'm pretty sure that number needs to be about 17, but for some reason it's sitting at 15. But the smaller the animal, the greater requirement for bypass protein, and that's why you see calf feeds and heifer feeds and lamb finisher feeds all have a higher protein than, say, a mature animal feed, because there'll be a portion of that feed which will be bypass feed, bypass protein. Something like canola meal will go into a finished product, or lupins will be used in a home mix to get that energy requirement up. And the reason they've got a greater protein requirement is because they're building bone and they're building muscle and they've got skeletal development occurring. So we need amino acids for that to happen.